So, hello and welcome to this homebound episode of the podcast. That's not really its own episode because I've got the wonderful Charlotte McAvoy
Hello.
again. Um, and we both have notes, which we didn't have last time. And that's important because I think when we sat down before, there wasn't any purpose or intent other than just to record for a block and have a good time and have fun. And doesn't that feel like a lifetime ago? Do you remember when that was a thing that was available?
Yes.
There's a wave of content that's out now that's specifically talking about the time it's being made. And my fear is that will age all of the content hideously. And so we'll just refer to the thing that's happened in the outside world that's affected what we can do very loosely. But what's been really good about that time, in which I haven't made, oh, that's not true, but in which I haven't made any aim low stuff like this, is the chance to reflect on the work as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And you also had some reflection on the specific stuff we did together.
Mm.
And I think we wanted to. Hey, I'm speaking for both of us, so feel free to just cut me off.
Yeah, I will.
I'm not talking for both of us. But I really wanted to continue that conversation because in re-listening to the last conversation we had, so many different feelings came up that I really wanted to talk about again, that I thought were really valuable, and if not more valuable than some of the stuff that was talked about at the time.
Yeah.
As well as kind of wanting to explore some big picture stuff. So I think I've already said that we both had notes, and you sent me your notes, which was amazing. I didn't send you my notes. Maybe I should have done that. But to talk to you about them now,
Okay.
my notes are very big picture stuff that I want to elaborate on and be really clear about.
Okay.
Which is cool. And your notes were really specific, which was great.
Okay.
So my vote as to how we lay this out is we maybe tag team note topics
Yeah.
in a very structured way, and we can kind of go back and forth and continue to have that dialogue.
Okay. Let's give that a go.
So, if I may, team big picture, could I go first with a thing?
Of course.
Awesome. So, firstly, I totally loved the conversation we had. It was really great. And for me, it was great for a number of reasons.
You mean which conversation?
The hour block which we sat down and spoke for.
The podcast that we did last time.
So when I say the conversation, yeah, I mean the whole thing. Because when viewing it as a whole, firstly, thank you for sitting down and doing it. And secondly, I really like lots of the things we touched on were much bigger and much were weightier topics than I thought we would cover. If you see what I mean. And I felt like there was immense value to that. And one of the things that was interesting when we went back was what's the right way around this? So the note I've got to kick us off is that when I went back and listened, I think that was the first time I'd listened kind of as a viewer.
Yeah.
And I think that was really key in that process. And I've done that with a number of episodes now. but obviously that was the first one in particular because it was the most recent and because of conversations we'd have. And something that I thought was really funny was how listening it as a viewer uh, changed how I felt about some of the stuff that was said.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was really good. And I was like for me, so this format kind of really serves two purposes for me. So I'm going to be selfish. Like the two purposes for me are both like, they're great creative expressions,
Yeah.
but also um, in a world in which there's not a lot of time allotted just for talking.
Yeah.
That talking is really valuable. And I mean that both in the sense of being able to completely stupidly screw around and talk about dumb news stories, and being able to have slightly weightier conversations about stuff that's going on, and having that freedom, if that makes sense. What I was most struck by was how the editing process, because obviously not only was I present for the recording, but then I had to sit down and edit it. I was struck by how different that process is than listening to it as a viewer.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. In a way that I kind of felt blindsided by, because I would have thought in doing this for 7 years that I would have already had that realization once I had it.
Yeah.
And I hadn't. And bear in mind that I'm an idiot. So this is all from that perspective. I think I said that at the time as well. I say it normally once, at least once, but I will say it twice. I'm an idiot. So you can take that for what you want. But in honestly explaining my experience, that was the biggest jump, was going like, oh, there's a different switch, if you like, from listening to it as an editor and listening to it as a viewer.
Yeah.
And the biggest blindsides for that for me was like listening to it as an editor. The voice I'm always trying to shut down is the voice that's like, oh, this bit of hair that I can see kind of poking off looks really weird. Like, don't worry about that. Your nose is big. I look kind of pink in this light. Like, it's all superficial stuff that now that I've put out there, oh, like my voice sounds dumb, because also, it's listening to it through like a proper. So like my voice sounds dumb. How many times are you going to say and
Yeah.
over like one sentence? Like all of that stuff kind of has to get squashed down to get through it.
Yeah.
And I think or the best example, which I'm sure we'll come to, is like, oh, you said that intending it to be a joke, and before you even get to what that joke was, nobody laughed. Like a dumb thing that you said intending to be like levity. And it's less more with one person. That happens normally when there's a group, and then that silence is deafening. But then there's always the thing of like, as well, and I'm sure we'll come into this too, is like, I've had the situation where like a totally a completely non-charged joke
Yeah.
that gets silence. I run into this huge like existential crisis of, well, when people are thinking, I tend to cut that silence just because who who needs to listen to that silence of somebody thinking about what they're going to say next.
Yeah.
When a joke doesn't land, a lot of the time I'm like, well, do I cut that silence? Well, that seems inauthentic to what happened, because I don't care if people know I'm not funny. I could live with that. That's fine. I'm not. So, like, what's the most authentic version of that when that's edited, if that makes sense? And so, yeah. And so then not having that and listening to it as a viewer was a totally different experience. And it would be one of the positive things that's come out of this experience, is being able to have that time free to just kind of explore outside my own head for a while some of the stuff that's there. And that's churned up a ton of things. But obviously, specifically with you, I'd like to get into stuff that was specific with that one episode.
Yeah.
And that seems like a good point to hand back off. any questions about that? Does that
No, yeah, that's
make
fine.
sense?
Yeah. And like you say about seeing things in different ways, it's the same. So like I hate watching myself on camera. So if I've done a movie or something, because I watch it and like you say, I just look at myself and I just go, why have you done that? Why have you made that choice? I can't see it. What to begin with, it's hard to see overall picture as a viewer because it's like a piece of, I don't know, it's work. It's something that you've made and that you want to make the best. And sometimes it's difficult to see the whole overall picture yourself to begin with. And then sometimes you do need other people to come in and say, actually, brothers, or have you noticed that you did this? To kind of take you out of it and to give you that, like you say, that space to look at it as the and I think as well something, and yeah, it's like you say, like it's so in the moment that things just happen and then you move over them,
And I think what comes to mind when you say that is the person who does that on set when you're making a creative decision is a director. Like that's their whole job.
Yeah.
And that's not something you have in this setting. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but in the interest of providing further context.
So what I did is when I was watching it back, there were a couple of things that were said in it that kind of raised a flag. Well, not, oh my God, this is dreadful. But just kind of in my brain, I was like, oh, does Dom realise what that means? And that's not necessarily, this isn't necessarily the place for that, and that's not necessarily funny. And that makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And it was specifically the kind of jokes about assuming gender and the kind of using Me Too as a synonym for about. And it made me think about language that we use and how phrases and words get put into the kind of everyday vocabulary, and then they get so far abstracted from what they actually mean that they do get used in the wrong sense. And I think that's what happened when watching it. For me, I think that's what happened in the podcast.
Yeah, and that's the concern, isn't it? Is that like everything that was said in good faith and with good intent, but listening as a viewer that might not understand, or not even might not understand, that's not the right way to put it, but yeah, it like a clumsy use of language could have further reaching consequences than what was intended.
Yeah. And to try and not even use those words and phrases in the first place.
Yeah, oh, totally. Yeah. And no, totally. And I think that dovetails really nicely into another big picture thing, which is like what I found really interesting in that, not even in those specifics, or of course in those specifics as well, but in some of the topics we talked about, like thoughts and feelings that were articulated, I feel completely different about now. And I remember feeling completely different about when editing it, just from having that space to have the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think, part of the reason that I want to have conversations like that is to grow and is to kind of build up a bigger and more informed understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So in no way is it all like See, the tricky thing is as soon as we're talking about being clumsy with language,
I get clumsy with language.
I immediately don't want to be clumsy with language. However, like it wasn't intended as like a soapboxing. It wasn't kind of like, okay, this is the thing where I'm gonna put a stake in the ground and be like, this is my opinion. Either get on board. I think at one point we talked about is it the Steve Crowder guy who does the Change My Mind, where he just puts up a sign with an opinion he knows will annoy people probably in order to generate a conversation. Do you know the guy I mean?
I know. I don't think we talked about it, but I do know what you mean.
Oh, okay then. Yeah. Well, him. That's fine. Yeah, it's not necessarily intended to inform or to educate, but I think this bit does kind of have that value because actually it's furthering that discussion. And like you said, if we were to have that discussion now, not only would I feel completely differently, therefore I'd articulate it differently, I would also choose to be far less clumsy with some of the language that's used.
And I would also be more ready and more comfortable to kind of call it out moment so that it
to
Does
talk
work.
about it.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And like as much as I don't have negative feelings that this didn't happen, but I would totally feel like I personally wouldn't feel attacked. Well, I don't feel attacked in you calling that out. Do you see what I mean? I think that's really important because I don't think it's not that necessarily because the thing I noticed from listening to it as a whole, again jumping back big picture, was it wasn't necessarily any one incident, but I think everything compiled together ended up having this air that I don't remember being in the room at the time. If you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think it is that thing of like that piece of context is quite hard to translate. And wanting to call it out in hindsight, I think it's totally right that we should do that, even though we stopped recording at a certain point 4 months ago or whatever it was. Do you know what I mean? I equally don't think that there's like a time limit on these things to be like, oh, actually, no, I feel differently about it now. Could we talk about that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Because one of the options when we were talking about it was just like, oh, well, part of me was like, oh, well, I'll just go through it and I can just rip out anything that's problematic.
Yeah.
But there was kind of two problems with that. One, that felt just as phony to me as like cutting out a joke that didn't get a laugh. Do you know what I mean? Like that felt just as like almost as like an admission of guilt without actually having to be guilty for anything.
But having with it.
Yeah, totally. Like there, if someone was to come up with me and say I had a specific problem with this thing you said, regardless of like the moral ethics of whether of kind of who's right and who's wrong, I would feel bad for affecting someone else's feelings, and their feelings are justified, and I would absolutely use their feeling and their dialogue to inform how I would behave in the future. And something that would upset me more would be the idea that I'd said, Charlotte, I've said this thing and it really offends you, and you don't say anything, and I continue to behave like that, and you just go off with like a deep sadness. Because and equally, I could have meant something to offend you. I hope you know that I wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had, I think it's probably worthwhile you knowing I'm a dick and also informing your own decisions.
Yeah.
Because I think we're flawed, and being clumsy with language is far easier than I would probably like to think it is. Specific. I mean, when you said like, there's always that thing. I know it's called that, and I think it's often used as an excuse. and it kind of bugs me, but like, when you sent me your list, and one of the things was using need to as a verb. When all of a sudden it was in that context, I immediately understood much more where that was coming from.
Yeah.
And it doesn't magically change my original intent. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't magically mean that when something like that is said, it's meant for offense, or even like it's meant to make a point. But having that extra step to unpack it is really valuable, because it totally informs how you go about talking about things moving forward. I think the conversation we had about gender and the representations of gender in media, and how we feel as two performers of different genders in that space, was really valuable. And my opinion has evolved and changed from what it was through understanding your experience and through understanding where the overlaps are. And like, to me, I felt like I feel like I'm prepared to look silly and to have my ignorance identified publicly, because that growth, I think, is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do kind of wish that there was the space after every episode, no matter how stupid, to sit down and have this discussion.
Yeah, like a post-show talk.
Totally. And many places do that. But I do kind of worry that it's the snake eating its own tail. I mean, I'd love to have you every week, and we could just go over what was said the previous week, until we eventually, I don't know.
We transcend and we know everything.
Yeah, totally. But the flip side of that is, as this wasn't, we weren't, we've had podcasts where we just talked about Superman for an hour. That doesn't necessarily need a post show. but given we talked about topics that do, and given that we're in a very lucky position to have the time at the moment to have this extended period of reflection, then let's do that.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? This
absolutely.
isn't an incidence of the snake eating its own tail. There's continued value in that.
And there's continued education and there's continued learning. Like, no one is born knowing everything and being right about everything. You have an opinion, live with it, you learn more things, you can change your opinion. That doesn't make you, and that just means that you're learning. Learn things, and if
you totally cut out there, so start your sentence
no.
again.
I was saying something really eloquent as well.
I know you were. I could see it in your hand movement, in the lip position, and I was like, "Oh God, how long do I let her speak until?" But hey, sorry.
I said that you are allowed, like, no one is born knowing all the right answers right about everything. That you're allowed to change your opinion if you learn something new that informs it. That doesn't make you a hypocrite. You don't have to have an exact opinion about everything all your way through life. You're allowed to learn things, and you're allowed to educate yourself, and you're allowed to educate others, and you're allowed to kind of build on things. And I think that's what this is doing, which is what I wanted when I first kind of messaged you about it. Because I was really nervous about it, because I was like, am I being too sensitive? Like, am I just being really silly about it?
That's another important thing to note. Like, this isn't off the back of anybody external coming to us.
Oh yeah, it was
This
me.
is literally just like me and you having this discussion.
Yeah.
Which I think is also great. It's not that I totally welcome any outside criticism and influence on anything. Do you know what I mean? From the language to the color of my walls. Like, that's fine. Some is easier to change than others, but yeah, I think, yeah, like you say, it's been very tricky for us to get an objective view, because we can't, both being there and what have you. But so yeah.
I was worried that, oh my god, am I being like too sensitive? Am I being really silly? But I was like, no, I'm gonna do it anyway. And like you said, you literally said to me, I'd rather you say that you were upset with something rather than just carry on in silence, because then I feel like I can't talk to you, and then you don't learn anything in reaction to it. You know what I mean?
Completely. I will continue to be even more of an idiot than yeah.
So and this is the thing, like when people are friends with someone, you should be able to say to your friend, I don't really agree with what you said, and this is why, X, Y, Z. That's a sign of like a healthy friendship. Be able to have these conversations with people. Whereas if you'd have just said, no, you're being silly, I'm not changing it, then I'd have been like, well.
As was my right, I'd like to add, but I'm just so nice that.
This is all just a stitch up. I'm going to be like, no.
Yeah.
Then I would have tried to explain to you, and then if you'd been like, no, whatever, then I would have been like, well, I don't feel comfortable. Bye. And I would have lost a friend, you would have lost a friend, and no one would have learned anything.
And I would totally feel that you were justified to do that in that circumstance. You know what I mean? Yeah, and I think actually, I'm veering away from notes here, so this is dangerous territory. But over this extended period of indoorsness, quarantine, and the positive of that being an extended period of self-reflection, I've got to have a number of these conversations privately, which I find immensely valuable. And I think, to be honest, I have been kind of frightened to have them publicly through the fear of making a mistake.
Yeah.
And I think something I was beating myself up about after several reflections of the other episode was actually like, I think those the clumsiest uses of language that were intended to be humorous came about because, or the thought process I could identify in watching myself do it was, we were talking about a topic that was kind of getting slightly heavy, and we were trying to kind of navigate our way through it. And in an effort to kind of keep resetting and bringing us back to kind of to kind of fully explore and fully play around, I'd kind of feel like I'd need to inject this moment of levity that's kind of vaguely to do with what we're talking about, and could kind of reset. I don't know if that's quite the right way to put it, but hopefully you're getting some idea of what. And that was a mistake. And listening to it as a viewer, I'm like, you fucking idiot. It doesn't need that. Do you know what I mean? Like, just let those moments sit.
Yeah, you're allowed to have those moments of seriousness and genuine kind of conversation.
Yeah. And
that's okay.
Yeah, I know you were talking about hypocrisy, but like, there's this weird. I'm kind of like, I want to have those bigger conversations in a way that's not too navel gazing, because, I think particularly when people try and comment on a situation that doesn't directly affect them. For example, when we're talking about female representation in media, I'm not speaking as somebody who is female, so there's always a leap there from my part. And there's other stuff I can talk about in a more informed manner, but also I wouldn't want to. I would potentially try and avoid that in order to avoid putting that on the other person as well. You know what I mean? Of like, oh, I don't want to make that other person have to make a leap and comment on something that, maybe there's just not on their radar, for rightly or wrongly. So that's how I felt listening back, was like, you can just let those moments sit.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And I think actually just as much as what is said, it's also the kind of the time and the place. And of course, like a podcast with friends is a fine space to make jokes.
Yeah.
Just maybe avoid it when you're in the middle of something meaty. And I certainly wouldn't consider this a how-to either. But I thoroughly see the importance of like identifying that and owning that, of being like, that was an action taken then, understanding that action even better, I would go a different way now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And also timing of jokes. And also, well, going back to kind of this wasn't the time to make a joke or whatever. I think what, again, with the language and that kind of thing, what you consider to be a joke as well.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
Got completely changed after this.
And that's okay. Like that's
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Because and again, I'm not somebody that inherently believes words are bad in and of themselves. But even just deepening the understanding of actually, this is an unintended effect that somebody could have from that, and completely understanding that. And actually, that is totally in line with why I started doing this. And again, we're off notes, but something that came to mind while you were talking about that, like the whole aim low thing has been an experiment in growth. There are videos up on the like main YouTube channel that I just can't get through. I just cannot get through. They are painful to watch. All of those normal voices, the nose, whatever, all of that stuff comes up. But they're hard. They're very like out there. But to me, it's really important to show that growth. Like watching the first thing that was up, and then jumping all the way to the most recent stuff, which to a certain extent has been fairly nightmarish as an experience to go through and do, but nonetheless a valuable, because I'm like, there's that growth. Do you know what I mean? And that growth's gone in a ton of different directions. And for me, I'm like, you don't get that growth without taking those first steps.
Nothing is a finished product.
Yeah.
I think seeing the growth that you've gone through to get to that point is just as important as you're at.
And specifically with the
Hello.
the fans. Did you hear that, or is that just me?
Yeah, I heard that.
Oh, okay. I can't remember. You take it.
Oh no. And what's your next note?
We've kind of covered. I think was kind of like, I've also talked about like what. So I've the process of doing it, which we kind of talked about, the importance of those tough conversations, and also like what is the podcast for? If you see what I mean, like, and I was a bit worried about this one because I didn't want it to sound like an excuse. I mean, I don't want any of it to sound like an excuse, but specifically this, because in saying, oh, well, it's for entertainment, I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't give you a free pass to do whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly. You can be entertaining without causing discomfort.
Well, you can be entertaining and cause discomfort, but neither of which was our purpose, if you see what I mean. So, like, when we sat down to have, I think I've already kind of gone over this, but when we sat down to have the conversation, at no point did we intend to cause discomfort. And like, at no point did we even intend to go into those weightier topics. But because we organically did, and because we had discussions that I think were really important, that's fine. and just because the purpose is to entertain, it doesn't mean we can't be truthful in what comes up. And I think that goes for now as well, as an extension of that conversation. That's important. And the fact that the purpose is to entertain doesn't necessarily give you, doesn't waive you from any responsibility.
Yeah.
Would be how I'd put it. That's it. Is there anything left on your notes?
Yeah, mine's plans for the future, not like the future of the podcast. What are your plans? I mean, like, what have you learned from this that you're going to apply to the future? So, for example, me, I'm very scared of confrontation, and I don't like any form of conflict. But I think from this, I have learned that I'm able to, and I now will, call out things like this in the future that people around me make, and if it makes me uncomfortable, I feel more able to say, like, actually, have you thought about this a little bit more? Rather than just like sit back and laugh and just like let it happen. Yeah,
because and that's awesome. That makes me so happy because like I'm totally the same. If a confrontation can be avoided, good. However, I think with this, well, would you feel that it's been a confrontation?
no.
So
But
that's
it was a fear. It was a fear that it
could be. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that holds lots of people back with a ton of stuff. I mean, even doing this, I was like, what's the right way to put this? Like, are you going to be confrontational with me? Are we going to end up? When I realized 10 minutes before we started that I didn't share with you my notes, like, is there stuff that's going to be an issue? And I think actually, if you're not approaching it from the position of I'm doing this for confrontation, then in my experience, it fairly rarely explodes into that on its own. And also, I guess, again, similar to what we touched on earlier, that if I had been confrontational, that would have informed your opinion enough of me to make a decision in the future.
Yes.
If you can't have an adult conversation with someone about these things, that should tell you everything you need to know moving forward. So yeah, I think my thing, I think I just shouldn't be. I mean, I live in this paradox where I am both sharing all the time and constantly afraid to share.
Yes.
And for want of a better term, because like again, when I started podcasting, there's no way I would have felt comfortable enough and adult enough to have that kind of conversation with you that affected me personally, let alone like was great as a thing I felt proud of making. Flaws and all, and in having this conversation, I definitely feel like the more I've relaxed into talking to you about it, the more I'm successfully articulating all the feelings about it than when I did at the start.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just cut that out. But yeah, so I and it seems like most people feel the way we do. From conversations I've had with other people, it seems like we kind of actually need that time to talk things through to get that growth. Because I think it's very hard to get change in your own bubble. And everything that's going on at the moment or has been going on, I think we're now very aware of what our own bubbles look like. when all the extraneous stuff has been stripped away. And I totally want to use this experience, both the podcast we did and what we're recording now, and the outside circumstances, as a force for positive change than just dwelling on the negative aspects of that. And again, I don't want to speak to both of us, but I'm also totally open to further criticisms. That might not be the best thing to just invite as a blanket, but you know what? Like, that's where the growth is, you know?
Have those
It's
conversations.
Totally true when you're in
feedback.
education is feedback. And yeah, and I think being that thing of sharing truthfully and honestly is often all the context you need. If like as you said before, I don't think anything was said in bad faith. However, through I think maybe being clumsy and a bit guarded, even like part of the thing, another part of the thing, even when listening to some of the slightly dumber stuff, was kind of like it potentially it was a way of showing that like I wasn't taking it seriously. In order to avoid being pinned down on anything. And actually, that's the stuff that's more problematic than just sharing the opinion in the first place, is in some way insinuating that you're not taking it seriously. So yeah, thank you so much for enabling this to happen.
Thank you.
Because I really wanted to continue to talk about it rather than just get rid of the whole thing or try and somehow Frankenstein monster it into something that would please all people forever. And this would have been far worse were it just me and the camera awkwardly stumbling my way through a piece of reflection. So I totally appreciate both putting yourself out there and calling out and all of the above.
Thank you. I really appreciate just your response to it, like, and being so like, oh my god, let's talk about it. Let's do this. Let's do that. Like, I didn't even consider that. I thought it would just be me and you having this conversation, and your idea of having it on another kind of podcast. I didn't even consider that would be a thing, and I'm now so glad that we've done it. So yeah.
I would like to also publicly thank all some other creative friends of mine that I've had to like kind of guinea pig test through stuff. So some I kind of sent the episode to and didn't say anything we were feeling. Some I sent the episode to and explained how we were feeling. And I totally want to do more of that. So thank you, people who did do that for us. And I'm going to annoy you again because it was really valuable. You know, on the whole feedback thing.
Well, it's like a book, isn't it? You wouldn't put a book out without having to proofread it first.
Yep, there's not a lot of proof. If anyone who follows Aim Low on socials with the spelling and grammatical errors, not a lot of proofreading goes on. But yeah, thanks. So I do kind of feel like I want to talk to you more. So I'm going to leave that open. But I do feel like it's worth kind of bookending this as its own thing. That I'm really pleased about. So is there anything else that you kind of want to throw out there to have on the table? To do with this, if you see what I mean.
To do with what we just talked about?
Yeah. I don't want to feel like I'm cutting you off from anything left sort of unsaid.
I don't think so. I mean, there's always going to be more to say about it. I can go on browse hours, but just the whole language evolving and meaning being so abstract originally mean it from. I think we use a lot of terms like that don't mean what we think they do. So, like, for one example, I was like, well, would I want someone to like speak up for me if I knew I found offensive was said somewhere else. So my example for myself, I've got really quite severe OCD, and when I hear people say, "Oh, I'm really OCD about that," when they're just like being tidy and neat, it just like, because it's weird. It's because I know you don't mean that, but you also, there's other ways to say what you're trying to say without taking something you don't have experience of and turning it into trivial. And I think that was kind of the basis. Am I being too sensitive about this?
And the other thing that I thought was that I was just knocked for six over was that it would be one thing if we were talking about this conversation we had 4 years ago, you know what I mean? And I've had that discussion on other podcasts where, oh, yeah, this thing I said right at the start, like 5 years ago, totally not okay now. And I want to call that out.
Yeah.
You know, and point out particularly as we moved on to other platforms and we had to kind of begin to censor specifically curse words and other words, what constitutes a curse word has totally shifted in the 7 years since we did it. So there was this weird kind of like thing that had to be spoken about, and we spoke about it. This thing happened like weeks. We could define this in weeks. Do you know what I mean? And I would even agree if we had this conversation the week after, we would be like, oh my God, here's all this same shit. We need to talk about it. So it's not necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily a time thing either. Because there's no kind of, there's no limit to how quickly your opinion can change on something. I can hear my opinion changing as we're having the conversation. So no wonder a few weeks later, I still feel very differently about it. And that was really cool too. And I think there's room for more of that discussion. So yeah, thanks for letting me have fun and not having this just be a tinfoil hat rant that I got to have alone here. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Awesome. Well, yeah, so I'm still Dom Lepresti, so I think we're going to sign off. You're still Charlotte McAvoy, the one and only. No relation?
To James?
Yeah.
No,
sadly not.
The way you said James made me think, oh, is there a relation? But yeah, so...
Cousin James? No, he's a Scottish A McAvoy.
Right. And although we're finishing this discussion, that doesn't mean anybody else has to. And I, for one, am still open to talk about it with anyone who is insane enough to take the time to want to do that.
Absolutely.
With me. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.